Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be looking at cash flow across all of our Accounts Advanced templates. You've got myself on the webinar today, Georgina Atfield. I'm one of the technicians here at Cashflow UK. And also I've got Phil Reeves joining me today. He is one of our senior professional services consultants. He's going to be taking you through the main presentation for you today. So like always, we allow for Q&A at the end of our webinars. So if you do have a question at all throughout today's webinar, then do post it into the Q&A field and we'll look to pose that to Phil at the end of the session today. So that's the agenda on screen there for us, and I'm going to hand over to Phil at this point.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Georgie, for attending. Thank you, Georgie, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. As Georgie mentioned, lots to cover in today's session. We're looking at the cash flow, the statement of cash flows, and the different ways that they are populated throughout the different templates. So, as I say, lots of information for us to cover in this session. But ultimately, do want you to be able to ask the questions that you've got. So we will spend some time at the end for any any questions that you have. So please, as Georgie mentioned, enter those into the Q&A feature, and we'll run through all of the questions that we got at the end of the webinar. Feel free to ask them as we go through. We'll get started. So as I say, we'll go through the three of the different templates: the Accounts Advanced for the FRS 101, 102, 105. Accounts Advanced IFRS for those that obviously are producing the IFRS financial statements, and then the Charity and Academy template as well. And the reason why we're going to run through all three is that there's a slight difference in the way that they are populated in terms of the statement of cash flows. So obviously the end result is ultimately, generally a completed statement of cash flow. But as I say, we use different techniques and approaches based upon client feedback, based upon what works best with the disclosure requirements within those templates. So we'll probably start with the Charity and Academy, go to the IFRS, and then finish off with the Accounts Advanced template, because in terms of difficulty, again, they do go up. And we'll also talk about some tips and hints that you've got with regards to populating some of these different types of statement of cash flows. So what I'll do at this stage, I'll just share my screen. There we go. And hopefully you should be able to see. We're going to go into our Heathland Trust file, which is our first example. So Heathland Trust Development FRS 102 charity file. And yeah, first things first, we're just going to talk about in this file the statement. Bear me 1 second. No, that's not. Bear me 1 second here. Let's remove them places. Actually, what we'll do, we're always ready. Let's go into the IFRS instead, and we'll wait for the charity one to resolve itself with the issues that it's got. So firstly, as I say, we're going to IFRS first. The IFRS is arguably the simplest, which is quite ironic considering the disclosures that are included are arguably the most complex. But in terms of actually producing a statement of cash flow, it's arguably the simplest because the majority of it is input. The only real automation we have from Caseware is obviously the calculations down and the profit for the year figure at the top, which pulls directly from our statement of profit or loss. The remainder of the notes, so our adjustments with regards to operating activities and movement in working capital, and our cash flow from investing activities and our cash flow from financing activities, are input figures. So essentially, it's up to us to go through and input the balances. And the main reason why we've done it that way is off the back of some of the feedback that we received on the FRS 102 template, which we'll see in a bit more detail later on. People wanted a little bit more flexibility on this with regards to where the information comes through, how the information populates. So that's what we aim to do as part of this process. So when we developed it, we give you a lot more flexibility with regards to where the numbers come through and how that information will be populated into the file. Ultimately, you still do have the error checking that you would get on at the majority, obviously on the other templates as well as the other notes within the financial statements. But in this template, it comes through the form of an other unallocated difference. So essentially what you get at the bottom of the statement of cash flows on the IFRS template is the cash and cash equivalents at the beginning of the year, which essentially populates from the prior year figure. So our cash and cash equivalents at the end of the year in prior year is obviously going to be our cash and cash equivalents at the beginning of this year. And then our cash and cash equivalents at the end of the year is calculated based upon the information that we've got within our statement of financial position. So obviously those figures that are mapped to the cash and cash equivalents map codes within Caseware. Now, the other unallocated difference is essentially what we need to do to ensure that the balance that we've got of the cash and cash equivalents is correct when we add our net increase in cash and cash equivalents to our cash and cash equivalents at the beginning of the year. So essentially, this is the number that we need to allocate into the table above, whether that's through additions and deductions, increases in other credit, in other trade and other payables, increases in trade and other receivables, impairments, depreciations, and we need to go through and we need to populate these cells. Now, one of the options that we have when we're doing this, as I say, is to try and potentially automate some of these figures if we can. So whilst these are input, if I go to the table tab on the toolbar, I do have the option to try and automate some of these figures because some of this information is available elsewhere within the financial statements. Now, this will really depend on what you're pulling through into these different sections. So for example, you've got increase in inventories, we've got depreciation of property, plant and equipment. Now there are codes built into the software, I should say, for this information. So we can automate some of this if we want to. And again, the only issue is that will take into account the total figure of those different areas as opposed to just the cash element. So there also may need to be an element of adjustment that we still need to make to these figures that we're importing into the cash flow. So just as an example, depreciation of property, plant and equipment, we can press the cell button here. On an input table within our templates on the charity and also on the IFRS template, we'll see this custom prop calc appear quite often on the input cells. Essentially, that's a custom property within the background of the template, which in this case is just saying that it's an input cell where we can either essentially input our own balance into the cell here, but what we can also do is we can remove this calculation and we can start, as I say, to automate some of these cells. So the depreciation in property, plant and equipment, we're using that information already within our admin expenses from the P&L side, but also from within our fixed asset note, our property, plant and equipment note within the balance sheet side. So all of that is pulling directly from mapping. So we can pull that into here as well. So if I go to the linkage button here, I've got the option to go through and I could, in theory, select the codes that relate to property, plant and equipment depreciation. So in this case, we've only got one. But if we had multiple, we could go, right, A01040052 is the charge for the period. We could add that in. If we needed to include the depreciation charge brought forward, we could add that in as well. But what that will do, and I can do the same for the prior year, is it will then start to automate this. So when I click OK, that balance is now automatically being included within the cash flow. And if I was to go back into my working papers, and just for the sake of argument, if I was to make an adjustment to that value, let's make it a little bit higher. Let's go for something extreme. So now it's 42,000. Go to the right template, which is this one. You'll see that now the current year will update automatically. So if we're going through and putting adjustments through, that's going to update on the face of the financial statements without us having to come back in and make amendments to these figures. And obviously the other benefit of this is when we roll forward the file, this information is automatically going to update, because ultimately when we update our mapping structure, then that's going to update accordingly within our file as well. So just something to be aware of with regards to an option. It's a good option to have. We can go through and we can automate some of these cells. And again, we can use that functionality in the charity template as well, as we're going to see in a bit more detail in a second. Ultimately, what you're looking to do within this template is get it down so that the values at the bottom on this other unallocated row equal to 0. But the other thing you can do is, in the event that this is a specific value, so just for the sake of argument, say we've allocated all of our balances and we have a balance here, and we know what that is, and it is related to something underneath the increase in cash and cash equivalents, We can also print this row by ticking the box on the left-hand side and typing in the appropriate values here. So you do have that option also. Okay. At this stage, what we'll do is we will quickly jump into our, we'll go into the FRS 102, just whilst I'm, just to give our charity template file the chance to update. It's not so much of an issue. We can go into a version that is already complete, because a lot of what we're going to discuss is very similar to the IFRS template anyway. So what we'll do at this stage is I will jump into this file. So ultimately, again, our most used template anyway is our FRS 102 template, our FRS 101, 105. Again, not so much 105 from a cash flow perspective. But if you're on this template and you do need to work on the cash flow, then you will find that this populates in a slightly different way. So again, you need to make sure that you're aware of the different population methods depending on the template that we're on. FRS 102, IFRS populate in very different methods. Now, the reason for this is, again, this template came first, so we used a slightly different method with this. But when you load in your statement of cash flows, you're going to notice that there's not, there's no input cells in there. There's not really any real detail in there. What we've got is a profit for the financial year line, which is populating directly from our statement of comprehensive income. We've got our cash at bank and in hand at the bottom, which is populating directly from, again, our balance sheet information. But ultimately, the rest of this information, these two lines here are just populating from what we had in the prior year. But the rest of it, there's no real information in there. There's no adjustments. There's no operating activities. There's no financing activities and no investment activities. And the reason for that is there's another document built into our process of producing the cash flow on the FRS 102 template that we need to consider as well. That process includes going into navigation, and in navigation, you have a cash flow button here. So the document is called the cash flow workings document. There is also an option on here to go to an Excel link case view document. To refresh it, which essentially will refresh the numbers in the cash flow based upon what we've got in the cash flow workings document. So if I just want to update these balances with what Caseware is making the assumption that these balances should be, I can simply refresh it. But what I always need to make sure I do in this process is actually go into the cash flow workings, as there are going to be instances where we need to make adjustments in there, where we need to take out potentially non-cash elements that are already, or in Caseware's case, being included within the statement of cash flow. So when we load up our accounts, we instantly go in and we open up our statement of cash flows. I'll give that a second to load. And what that's going to do is that's going to actually pull the information from the mapping that we've done previously within our working papers, pull that into the cash flow and start to calculate some of the potential values that are included within the statement of cash flows. So simply by going into the accounts option, you can see when we're back in our financial statements, values are started to pull through into the statement of cash flows based upon that information that we put in our cash, or that we've now got in our cash flow workings document. So this doesn't populate until you access that workings document. But again, what we want you to be aware of is the fact that just because these numbers are now pulling through, it doesn't necessarily mean they are correct. There will be areas like depreciation of tangible fixed assets, which, again, hopefully will be roughly what we're looking for based upon the mapping that we've applied. But there'll be other areas whereby Caseware simply has to make an assumption on the increase or the decrease based upon the information that you've given it within the working papers. And ultimately, that's because we don't really want to include additional map codes where we don't need to within the file itself. So what we have the option to do in here is, if I go back to the cash flow workings document, this will show us essentially a breakdown of how this information has been calculated. So for the current year, we use current year and prior year. For the prior year, we use prior year and prior year too. The first thing to note is that if you don't have prior year 2 data within your file, there is a workaround that you can use to ensure that you can still get that data into the cash flow workings, because otherwise what you'll find is if you just leave it using the standard method, then prior year will just be whatever, say, for example, the debtors, the increase in the debtors will be whatever the debtors value is, because it's got nothing to compare it with. So if you haven't got prior year 2, what you need to do is just go to the bottom of this screen and choose the option to use the summary workings for the prior year. Switch that to yes. And what that gives us, essentially, if I go back to the accounts, from an account side, it gives us a blank prior year again. And from the workings document, we can go to the prior year at the top using the radio buttons that we have at the top of the screen. We can go to the drop down here and select workings, and it will give us an input table, very similar to what we saw on the IFRS template, to type those balances in should we need to. So I can go down and say, right, the decrease and increase in debtors was whatever it was. And again, we essentially would go to the prior year set of financial statements and copy those numbers into the appropriate lines within the prior year column. If obviously, as we have in this instance, we've got 3 years worth of data, we can switch that back to no, and it will populate accordingly within our file. Again, as I said previously, though, the main issue that you get when it comes to these areas, if I go to the current year, is when we look at things like tangible fixed assets, or when we look at things like debtors, and any of these areas, really, inventory is an example as well. When you're looking at the balances that come through into the accounts, it is essentially just looking at the total debtors in the current year and the total debtors in the prior year, doing a comparison between them, the two balances, and essentially saying, right, whatever the difference is the increase or the decrease. What it doesn't take into consideration is potentially any movements that have taken place in those areas. So and we'll look at some examples of adjustments that we might need to make within the statement in a second. Because you will, for areas such as, purchases of tangible fixed assets for bank loans and for, could be purchases of intangible assets, you will need to make adjustments within the cash flow to correctly account for those and ensure that only the cash element is being included. Now, the way to do that, again, I'll use that example that I just mentioned about tangible fixed assets. If we go back to our accounts, we can see that in the period we purchased a tangible fixed asset of 105,000. That has been mapped to one of the codes in the tangible fixed asset area ending 02. All the additions end in 02 on the mapping structure. But what that doesn't take into consideration at this stage is any of that purchase that potentially wasn't cash. Now, we could have just spent £105,000 of cash on the purchase of the tangible, but it's, there is a chance that we could have potentially, hire purchased some of it, or we could have leased an element of it, or it could be, that only a small proportion of that is actually cash. So what we need to do in our cash flow workings is actually adjust for that. And the way to do that is firstly to select this drop down here, where we have the option for either specific financial statement areas, or we can go to the worksheet at the top. And in here, we can start to make those appropriate adjustments. Now, as you can see, we have all of the areas are now listed on this screen. As I say, if you go to the drop down here, you can select just, for example, tangible fixed assets. But it's really up to you. There's no right or wrong way of getting into this document. Now, in this example, this is where the number's coming from. We've got an addition of a tangible fixed asset of 105,000. That is now being assumed within case, or it's been assumed within case where that purchase was fully cash and it was an investing activity, and that was value of 105,000. What we need to make the adjustments for is that non-cash element, or potentially capitalized element, or in the acquisition of subsidiaries example, any acquisition transfers example would need to be accounted for as well. So in the example of the addition, we could say, right, for the sake of argument, 90,000 of that was non-cash. And what Caseware will do is it will automatically account for that by reducing the value of the purchase down to 15,000. So this cell plus this cell and this cell and this cell all need to equate to the same value as our addition. And Caseware will do that so automatically now assumes that purchases of 15,000. If I go back to my account, you'll see that the purchase of the tangible fixed asset has been reduced. What you'll also see is now we've got a difference of 89,999. We've got a 1 overall because we can clear a 1 on the face of the financial statements. But what you need to ensure is when you're making these adjustments, that this adjustments column equals down to 0. So there's a couple of ways that you can obviously apply that. You need to either find an appropriate line within the existing table, so trade creditors or loans or whatever is appropriate for that second side of the adjustment. Again, that's based on your own accounting opinion. And we can put that, for example, to here. Or if you can't find exactly what you're looking for in this process, then you also have the option to create a manual adjustment at the bottom of the screen. So I can put a description into here. I'll just call it, for the sake of argument, an example in this instance. And say, for example, I haven't put the 90,000 in here. I could say, right, actually, 90,000 is going to go to our example 1. And then it is up to us to decide whether that second part of this goes to operating activities, investing activities, or financing activities. So we balance the adjustments column, but now we need to balance the row itself by saying, actually, what is this? Are we taking, and in this case, we'll say we're going to put minus 90,000, the other side of this, to operating activities, and Caseware will account for that accordingly. So now we'll have an example 1 row of 90,000. Our purchase row of tangible fixed assets is now 15,000. Similarly, if I just show another quick example, we got bank loans and overdrafts. This is one that we often see. Bank loans in the current year is minus 90,000. In the prior year was 102,000. That difference of 12,000, Caseware would assume, is a repayment. But what it doesn't take into consideration are any new loans that have occurred within the period. So say there was a new loan of 50,000. We would need to account for that manually within the statement of cash flows. And again, we need to make sure that this area, so this bank loan section, calculates properly, because at the moment, this value plus 50,000 minus 12,000 doesn't get us to 90,000. So because we got a new loan of 50,000, we need to change the repayment, in this case, to 62,000. And that now accounts properly to give us from the 102 down to the 90. And if I go to the accounts, that again will be accounted for correctly within the financing activity section. Now we've got 50,000 of new loans and a repayment of 62,000. So again, just to reiterate, you shouldn't assume that the balances that are showing in the statement are correct when you first load in the cash flow workings. There may be instances where you need to make adjustments. If you really, really are not a fan of the statement of cash flows document and that workings document that Caseware has as part of it, then what you can do is you do have the option to acquire a statement of cash flows Excel document. So that can be acquired from our knowledge base. If anyone wants a link to that, please let us know and we can send that across to you. But ultimately, what you end up with, if I just bring this onto the screen now, let me just open this up. So you go onto our knowledge base, you download a copy of the document, and you will be able to, there we go. And let me just bring this up on the screen, and you'll be able to download this document. So it's called the Cashflow link. As I say, it's available from our knowledge base. Georgie will give you the information about how you can get to the knowledge base at the end of this webinar. But essentially, you download this, you take a copy of it, and you chuck into your Documents Manager. And this will give you a lot more control over how you populate the statement of cash flows on a corporate file on the FRS 102 template. You copy this into the Documents Manager. And the main thing you need to do is you need to go to Properties and copy the name of the document into the number. The number is the identifier within Caseware. But when I click OK to this, now I can double click, open this up, and I can start to make an amendments and just essentially manually populate this in the same way, very similar to what we saw with the IFRS template, but instead we're doing it within Excel. So you type the balances in to the appropriate cells. Just for the sake of argument, let's just put a value into depreciation of tangible fixed assets, make it positive. We also do the same for the prior year. So you can manually populate this sheet, save it, and if we go back into our financial statements, instead of using the cash flow workings document, instead of using that process, we can actually go to the top of the cash flow and choose to use the Excel import option. So we click the question mark icon, and it will give us the option, say an alternative to using the existing cash flow worksheet, it is possible to import pre-calculated figures through Excel summary sheets. So because we've added those into the working papers, we can actually populate from here by ticking the box, and that'll pull that information in. Just to reiterate, if you don't go through the process of renumbering this to Cashflow link, if I call this document 1, then you'll see that when we go into the caseware file, if I tried to click this question mark, it would say there were no Cashflow links document in the documents manager, and it wouldn't allow us to use it. So essentially at this stage, I've broken the document because I've gone through and I've said I want to use the Cashflow link document. Then I've got rid of it essentially by renumbering it. And now I can't go back to the other version without removing and replacing the note. So I could go remove and replace, which will switch it back to the Cashflow workings document. Now, the final document we're going to talk about is the Cashflow in the charity template, which I will just open up here. And this works in a very similar way to what we saw within the IFRS template, which is why ideally I wanted to do one and then the other, but gives us a little break with a different method of the corporate file. The main difference is we still got our input cells for cash flows from investing and cash flows from financing activities. But the main difference is the net cash used in operating activities is actually pulling from the reconciliation of net movements in funds to the net cash flow from operating activities note within the table. So all this is just a single line, and the actual breakdown of those net cash flows used in operating activity is populated within the note itself. So we can still use the same options I mentioned previously, where we can go to table and we can use the sell button to make these adjustments automated. But ultimately, if I go and put a value into here, and then I go and put a value of decrease in debtors, I'll type in for now. You'll see that the value that populates at the bottom of this table is ultimately the value that will populate in these cells at the top on the statement of cash flows. This is more of like a summary line for the details within the notes to the statement of financial position. So in the note at the bottom. The other thing you'll notice on here is when we get to the bottom, there's a slight difference in the way that the bottom of the cash flow populates on this particular template. Our cash and cash equivalents in the year is basically calculated from the table above. But the difference is the cash and cash equivalents at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year currently are the equivalent to the difference that needs to be cleared. So at the moment, Caseware thinks that the cash and cash equivalents at the end of the year should be 0. And the reason for that is the other thing you need to do in this instance of using the charity or academy template is you also need to provide the breakdown of the detail of the cash and cash equivalents at the end of the year. So to do that, you need to actually go back down to our notes to the statement of cash flows, and you need to go to the analysis of cash and cash equivalents note, and you need to populate this section as well. Now, this is definitely an instance where I'd look to automate it where possible. So I can go to the sell button, remove these calculations, go through and say, right, cash and cash equivalents for the year, banking cash was this for the current year. And I can copy that for the prior year, change YR0 to YR1, click OK. And that now will automate this. So again, if I go through and do an adjustment, this will automatically pull through any adjustments that have taken place. Now you populated this area, if I go back to the statement of cash flows, our difference is more in line with what we're expecting. So we need to clear 101,265 into the table above for the current year and 15,000 for the prior year in order to go through and clear those rounding differences. The other thing I would say to do and recommend is that because this cell here populates from the prior year cell, the end of the prior year populates the beginning of the current year, please make sure you clear the prior year first when you're doing these. Otherwise, what you find is, just for the sake of argument, if I go and chuck all of that to this line here, I need to make that positive. So I go and clear that. So now the current year is fine. If I now go and clear the prior year, it then puts that difference back in the current year because this value is now changed. Do the prior year first, then do the current year on the charity template. Okay, I've just realized I am running dangerously close to time. So I will hand over to Georgie for any questions that we've got. As I say, there is some more information on the statement of cash flows and populating available on our knowledge base, which Georgie will direct you to in a second. So back to you, Georgie.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so no questions currently, Phil. She says one's just come through. So we've got one here. Are you able to get a cash and cash equivalents note in the FRS 102 template? We have an issue whereby some of cash equivalents aren't in the cash in hand and at bank on the SOFP.
Yes, you can. It should be available within the accounts prep table. If I'm hearing the question correctly, let me just, are you able to get cash? Yeah, so there is a cash and cash equivalents note available in the FRS 102 template. You just need to go into the accounts prep table, locate it. It will be item number 35-ish. Again, that differs depending on the type of accounts you're producing. It will be available on there. You just turn it on, and then it will populate the note, populate the balance sheet or the statement of financial position. The reason for that is the note flow, the value flows to the note and then up to the statement. So you can also reconfigure the balance on the balance sheet to populate directly from the mapping, which again, if you want some more information on, just drop us a message and I'll send it across to you separately.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay. Can I just confirm with you, Phil, what screen can you see currently?
I can see my screen. Actually, yeah, which is the wrong one. I think I need to stop sharing. I think you need to share. There we go. That's better.
Yeah, you can see my stuff now.
Yeah.
Perfect. Brilliant. Okay. Brilliant. Right. Any further questions at all, feel free to carry on logging them whilst the webinar is still continuing, and we'll look to get back to you afterwards. Okay, so if we look at upcoming webinars then, if you head over to that page in particular on the screen there, you'll be able to register for upcoming webinars and also see all of the agendas for those. So in particular on Thursday, we've got one on our new Ada, which is our AI digital assistant. So if you want to take a look at that, then head over there and register. And then we've got some educational ones coming up as well. So Phil in particular is back on screen next month, running a introduction to Note Builder Advanced webinar. And then we have some scheduled for the new year already. So take a look and register for those. Social media then. So we have a couple of social media platforms I just want to bring to your attention. So we've got our LinkedIn, which is our Client Services Caseware UK Limited. If you head over there and give us a follow, we post it on there sort of a minimum of once a week, both educational and product release as well. So if you want to give us a follow and keep in touch via LinkedIn, and also our YouTube channel as well. If you're able to subscribe, then do so. We do include on there all of our quick vids across all of our products. We've got playlists on there, so you'd be able to see the section that is relevant to your licensing. We are recording today's webinar, and we will place a recording of that on our YouTube channel for you to be able to catch up on. We do have our knowledge base as well, so we will place a recording of the webinar today on our knowledge base for those of you that are unable to access YouTube at your workplace. So the knowledge base there is my.caseware.com. It's a new knowledge base that we released probably sort of a month or two ago. So we previously had a help site, so you may be familiar with that, but we do have a knowledge base available now. And as Phil mentioned, you'll be able to get that cash flow document from our knowledge base. Perfect. Okay, so that concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much for attending, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Is that Rob?